Right. Okay. First of all, can everyone see the front page of my presentation?
Yes, but they're all muted, so
Oh, right. That's true. Okay. Right. Well, I'm sure someone will yell if they can't, if something goes wrong. So, hello everyone. I'm Andrew Wood. I'm the Hertfordshire Butterfly Recorder and also the records collator for the branch, so covering records in Hertfordshire and Middlesex, i.e., North London, effectively, but going right down into part of what is now Surrey, down in Spelthorne around Staines. But anyhow, this talk is one in a slot which I've had for several winters now. It started off as me just talking about the annual report, but after a while I felt that there was more to be said than just rehashing what was in a publication, which most of you should have received by now. And we do have copies if you haven't. So that's the annual report. And let's see what we can find out. So what I want to do is look at the butterflies and moths, and obviously moths aren't in the annual reports, so that's a bit extra. And it's a bit of a teaser. Can we predict long-term changes? Well, whether we can or not, we'll find out. So let's bash into this when the screen moves along. Hey, that's it. It's gone a bit sluggish. Right, so first of all, a little bit of background. I'm sure everyone is aware that our climate, our weather is changing, and these are just some headlines from the BBC's website showing that in the last few years we've had extremely warm weather. That won't come as a shock to anyone. Even in poor year, what seemed like poor butterfly years, or even poor warm years like 2024, that was still the UK's fourth warmest year on record. And all these weather and climate events obviously having an effect on our butterflies, and I'm going to delve into that in a little bit more detail. It's worth remembering that 2024 was a very warm year because this takes an average across the whole 24 hours of the day, not just the daytime temperatures. So we have to remember that nighttime temperatures are also elevated. So it isn't just the weather that we see when we're out and about looking for butterflies. It's the whole weather leading to a whole climate is all altering, even when it's dark and there's no butterflies around. Now, this is a chart which I've taken, as you can see, from another website. I can't claim authorship of this, but what it graphically shows is how in recent years the average temperature in the UK has altered. So this is what's called a 30-year moving average. So basically at the bottom of the chart in 1925, we have an average of every year from 1896 to 1925. And then as the years move on, we drop 1 year from the end and add 1 year from the start period and add one year onto the end. So you can see that there was some up and downing these squares, and then suddenly around about 1995 there is such a straight line increase, and the average temperature in the UK has increased by virtually a degree. And that doesn't sound much, but when you think we're looking at temperatures in the daytime between about 0 and 30 degrees across the whole year, an increase of one degree is quite significant, especially compared to the relatively small increase of 0.3 of a degree up and down over the previous 60 years. So I'm just putting all this background in to give us some wider information about the climate and the environment before I start looking at some specific examples from our particular area. So first of all, I want to say a couple of things about the big butterfly count. These are the headlines. This is obviously butterflies failed to shine despite hottest UK summer on record, and Countryfile, which was a partner with Butterfly Conservation, hottest UK summer on record, why are butterflies still failing to thrive? And it's interesting that many people said to me and have said elsewhere in 2025, oh, it's such a good year for butterflies. There were so many butterflies around. And even before we had all the data to crunch, it was quite clear that it wasn't a particularly good year for butterflies. It was just a heck of a lot better than 2024. And people tend to have rose-tinted spectacles and see this as more than just a bounce back to something around about the average, but as something rather more spectacular, which is great that people are optimists. But unfortunately, the data from the big butterfly count and from everything else, the transects, all the records we get on iRecord, etc., showed that it was really just a return to somewhere around about the average. Now, when the butterfly report was published, for various reasons, butterfly conservation hadn't sent out the big butterfly count results to recorders, even though they'd obviously been available for some time. But I have received them now, and I just want to say a few words about them because they do make a difference to some of the data that was in the report. So these are all butterfly species where the big butterfly count data has made a difference. And you can see these are really what you might call the core common species, partly because that's what's featured within the big butterfly count, and also because they are the most widely encountered species. And you'll see that in the report, many of them, in terms of, and we're talking about distribution here, I should emphasize, so the number of 2 kilometer squares in our area that they've been seen in. And you can see that there were complete set of down percentages for 2020 to 2024. And that was because it was missing a lot of the squares, which are only recorded in the big butterfly count. Because we cover a lot of suburban areas, particularly in North London, but also in some of the big Hertfordshire towns, a lot of the recording in those areas is really only done in people's gardens or in local parks. And a lot of that only occurs during the big butterfly count. So I thought it would be instructive to see what difference that made. And you can see that we do have some ups, but you'll notice that compared to an average of 2020 to 2024, all the ups, apart from the common blue, are pretty small. They're all single figured. And some of them are just changes from slight down in the before we had the data to a slight up. So they're where they have gone down, often the down compared to 2024 is quite small. You can see there's a couple that are under 1%, so they're insignificant really. But I do want to draw your attention to one particular thing, and that's the small tortoiseshell, and we'll be talking about that a bit more in a moment. When I did crunch the data for the annual report, it was quite appalling that only 24% of the recorded squares included a small tortoiseshell record. So that was down 60% over the longer term average. And I thought, oh gosh, this really is terrible. So you can see we got up to 45% with people seeing them in the big butterfly count, but that's still down 25% on the longer term average. And that's by far the biggest drop of any of the butterflies. So we're still very concerned about small tortoiseshell, and I'm not sure that the reasons are in, yeah, there are various theories put forward, but I'm not sure that we've really got to the root of what's going on there. But I wanted to present this data just to bring you up to date a little bit more and show you again that 2025 was not a brilliant year, in that things were round about the long-term average for most species rather than anything particularly spectacular. So let's look at the small tortoiseshell in a bit more detail. So there we have a small tortoiseshell, and what I've tried to do is have a look at some data comparing the last 5 years up to last year, comparing it to 1975 to 1994, so a long period. The reason I've gone to 1975 is twofold. One is quite lucky because it just happens to be 50 years before 2025. But prior to 1975, butterfly recording was rather different. Most records that came in, with a few exceptions, generally for the unusual stuff, tended to be people saying, oh yeah, we've had quite a lot of red admirals. Yeah, there's been a few small tortoiseshells during seen in July, not records that you could really do a great deal with. You couldn't really crunch the numbers, they were too vague. But from 1975 onwards and right up to 1994, we got better quality records. This is partly due to the survey that was done for Brian Sawford's book in the early first half of the 1980s, and also for Colin Plant's book on butterflies of Greater London. So that gave us some data which we actually had to date level. And what I've done is mapped here using graphs similar to those which you'll see in the annual report. But I just wanted to try and explain them a bit more, because obviously we can show them much larger on a screen than you can see them in the annual report. So what we have are the black blocks are the percentage in any particular week of that species that was flying. So it's not numbers, it's actually the percentage of the flight. And then that same thing is shown with the orange lines for that whole period, 1975 to 1994. And anything that appears in black to the left of the orange is flying earlier, and any big white areas between the black and the white is a drop in that particular period. So you can see that butterflies are emerging at much the same time, or peaking at much the same time as they emerge from hibernation in the case of the small tortoiseshell. But you can see there is a significantly earlier emergence with that quite a big black block before you get to the really taller orange bit. Then we have a dip down, and then the summer emergence is much earlier. You can see that it actually peaks well before it peaked in the longer term, and that the numbers start declining fairly quickly. And the numbers seen in the autumn, if we say, or late summer, so if we say from August onwards, are much lower. So it's a change in behavior, and the fact that they come out earlier, they fly earlier in the summer brood, and there seem to be very few of them in the late summer, suggests that, and certainly evidence from things like Malcolm Shedd suggests that small tortoiseshells are beginning to, or not beginning, are going into hibernation much earlier in the year than they used to. And this is the percentage of small tortoiseshells that have been recorded later than the first week of August. And you can see that has dropped from round about 18% in the 1975 to 1994 period. And then there's a bit of up and down variation, but we're now down in the last period to just under 10%. So the number of small tortoiseshells flying is considerably fewer in terms of the number of percentage of small tortoiseshells on the wing later in the summer and onwards into the autumn. So there's been quite a change in behavior there, and it's been posited that the warming climate is pushing them to emerge earlier, to go into hibernation earlier. But whether they actually accumulate the fat reserves to then last through not just the winter, as tended to be more of the case, but actually through a lot of the summer when it could be quite warm and desiccating, is possibly one of the reasons. There may be others, but certainly I think this is a butterfly that is showing some climate related change. And the worry is that if we're talking about predicting longer term change, if things can get any earlier, and one thinks how much earlier could they get, and then you think back that the best butterfly day this year so far was I think it was February the 25th, when we had one very warm day with lots of butterfly records. And I know we've had warm days in February before, but it's becoming much more consistent to get warm days in February and early March. For instance, I've always said, and I've said this for many years, that the peak, well, not the peak, but when you were most likely to see an emerged butterfly coming out from hibernation was around about the period March the 11th to March the 13th. Well, that's still a week away from where we are now, and yet we're already seeing lots of butterflies on these unseasonably warm days. So let's have a look at the peacock. So I'm just going to pick out a few species to see if we can see any of these patterns and discuss what might be happening. So here we go, the peacock. And The graphs are just on the same basis, so I'm not going to explain them all again in terms of the philosophy behind them. But you can see two things here, I think. One is the earlier flight period in both the emergence from hibernation, but also in the summer emergence. And you can see, particularly on the right-hand side, there is a vast area of clear white space between the black and the orange lines, which indicates that they are actually ceasing to fly earlier, therefore going into hibernation much earlier. And also, one other interesting thing is that the proportion between the hibernating ones and the summer emergence is now very similar. It's round about 50-50 or maybe 55-45, whereas looking at the graphs for the older period, there were definitely more emerging in the summer from breeding activity than were emerging from hibernation. So that's an interesting change. And certainly at the moment, there seem to be plenty of peacocks emerging from hibernation. I think one of the things we have to think about, possibly with these butterflies that hibernate as adults, is if we suddenly get a very cold spell with sharp late frosts, will that have an effect on the populations if so many more have already emerged from hibernation? So far, we haven't had a vast amount of late frost, but it's still quite possible in March and April that we could go into a particularly cold period, and that could have unfortunate consequences. Now, the red admiral, this is an interesting species because, as we've often commented, it is now our one around the year butterfly. And if in 1975 anyone had suggested that there was going to be a butterfly that could be seen in flight on a regular basis, not necessarily huge numbers, but on a regular basis every month of the year, certainly in southern England at least, I think no, people just wouldn't have believed that. And the fact that, it was, all the books say it's a migrant, and therefore you're not going to see them early in the year. And you can see in the 75 to 94 data, that's very much the case. There's odd ones seen, but basically the lines bounce along the bottom of the graph near 0%. And then you can see various peaks, which are representing certainly the first one, periods of migration, the others possibly periods of migration combined with periods of breeding within this country. And you can now see that there is a very distinct peak from 2021 to 2025 around about the beginning of July. Now, how much that is, that shape, almost a classic bell curve with another slight peak at the beginning of September, which presumably it could be a mixture of migrants or the offspring of that summer brood. How much that is going to be the new pattern, we can't really tell, but it's certainly a very different flight pattern to what was expected in the 1975 to 1994 period. And I thought it'd be interesting, again, using a rolling total of our winter red admirals. So what I've defined as a winter red admiral is a red admiral flying free and seen in November, December, January or February. And so it's a 10-year total. So we take the last 10 years worth of data at any particular point. And obviously these dates are 1999 to 2000 because the season that we're looking at is the November to February period. And you can see how, rather like that climate graph, but we've got a similar pattern that from the mid 90s onwards, the number of late records has been climbing pretty steadily. It goes up and down a bit. There was a bit of a drop 2016-17, but it soon recovered. And there's another dip 2024 to 25, which was probably down to how few were around in 2024, how few butterflies were around at that period. So I think that total, that rolling total there, shows a continuing increase in the number of late and early, i.e. winter flying red admirals. So let's have a look at the comma, and not so much to say about this, but you can see a similar pattern of it emerging slightly earlier from hibernation and flying much earlier in the summer. So you can see that it's peaking in late June compared to something like mid-July in the older period. But again, the amount flying in the autumn, and I think this is borne out by the number of records that we've recently had for both the red abra and comma around things like ivy, which is where the big source of nectar is in the autumn. The numbers seen at that particular point have been much lower, and that perhaps indicates that even this species is perhaps hibernating a little earlier than it used to. But we still have the same pattern of 3 peaks, which seems to have disappeared from the red admiral. Okay, so large white, what's that doing? Not so much of a change, except that it's again emerging earlier and declining late, more quickly. But it's interesting that once we get into September, we can see that there is an extended flight. It's obviously the summer brood, maybe some of those that emerged early in the summer have managed to breed up and produce a partial extra brood. It's difficult to tell, but certainly they are present much longer into the autumn, or in much greater numbers into the autumn than they ever were in historic times. So that's interesting. And again, that all that data, the earlier flight and the longer flight, all talks to climate conditions, warmth being greater than it was in the older period. And the question that always occurs to me is how long can this go on? How much warmer is it going to get? And what effect will this have on butterflies? Will they be able to keep adapting, as they seem to be to some extent? Or will we start getting problems like we did with the wool, possibly, where you get extra broods which can't really complete an appropriate level of life cycle before it does get too cold? And obviously it does still will get colder in the winter, whatever climate change brings. Small white is quite spectacularly earlier than now than it used to be in the last quarter of the 20th century, peaking in mid-June rather than mid-August. So that's quite a change. And you can see the flight again. If you look at the earlier records in April, much stronger flight earlier on than in the historic period, but still flying well into the autumn. And that's certainly, anecdotally, there seem to be a lot more small whites seen in the autumn, until well after we've had the first frosts. Of course, first frosts are often later than they used to be. First frosts later than they used to be. So we're seeing quite a change there. Green vein white is a very similar pattern. I won't repeat the ins and outs of that every time, but you can see again emergence in the spring, very much earlier and greater, though the actual proportion of the numbers between the two broods remains fairly similar. But it's quite distinctive there that even the green vein white, which doesn't tend to fly as late as the other two, is still managing to record a reasonable number of butterflies on the wing right up to the end of September and the beginning of October. Okay, small copper, which is a species that has been of some concern in recent years, and the pattern here is quite interesting. There seems to be much more consistency through the year now in the proportion of small coppers flying. There are obviously ups and downs reflecting the different broods, but the ups and downs are nothing like they used to be, and than there was in the previous period. So I think what that suggests is that small copper obviously flies earlier in any particular brood than it did 25 years ago. But it also suggests that there is less separation between the broods as well. So even though the broods are less, sorry, as well as the fact the broods are less distinct, that there seems to be much more chance of seeing a small copper on the wing in any particular week of the year, all the way from mid-April right through into November. And speckled wood, so looking at a woodland butterfly, this is particularly interesting, I think, because it's always been the received wisdom that the peak for the speckled wood is at the end of August, beginning of September. That's what I've always felt. It's what I've always told people. And you can see that is very much the case in the 75 to 94 data. Excuse me. So this species obviously has overlapping broods because it can spend the winter as both a caterpillar and a chrysalis. So it tends to be present throughout the year, which is what it was and is now. But you can see that each of these broods is peaking at more or less the same time. And in fact, there is a beginning of a decline in the flight around that late August, early September time, which used to be considered the peak. And so we have 3 even peaks, at least 3 even peaks throughout the year. And it was becoming much more common that the brood which is flying in July is as likely to be as large as the brood that's flying in the autumn. So we're not having that pattern of the broods catching up with each other to form a peak in the late summer, early autumn. So that's definitely a change in flight pattern. And also the number of early records in April is much greater as well. So they're flying earlier, flying longer, but flying more evenly. Worth looking at a few single brooded species, because these ones like the White Admiral have a fairly limited flight period, and it's been realized for a long time that with the White Admiral, all the textbooks say, oh yeah, it's found from the end of June into mid-August, and you can see that the orange lines reflect that. But the number of August records in the last few years has been very, very tiny, bearing in mind that the number of White Admirals seen in the county is never very high, and it's been particularly low over the last few years. You can see that basically its flight period now is mid-June to July, and to see it any later is quite rare. And the position of the black bars and the vast amount of white there is under the orange just backs that up. So that's perhaps what would be expected with a warmer climate. Orange tip shows this graphically as well. You can see that March records much more common than they used to be. It's peaking now in early May, whereas it used to peak somewhat later, and it's declining fairly quickly. And the number of records in June and even into early July is virtually nil now. So it's very much a butterfly of late March, April and May, rather than April, May and June. Just another 2 or 3 single brooded butterflies. So the ringlet showing the same sort of behavior, flying earlier, finishing earlier, and peaking not that much, interestingly, not peaking that much earlier than the longer term average, but still peaking a bit earlier. Now the marbled white, this is quite interesting because it's also a bit trickier, because in the 75 to 94 period, the marbled white wasn't exactly a common species in Hertfordshire and Middlesex. It's really confined to the chalky regions along the north and west of Hertfordshire, but obviously in this century particularly, it has spread to become a common butterfly across the whole of Hertfordshire and most of London as well. But you can see how much earlier it's flying, and its previous flight period, indicated by the orange line, is very, very much later than it is now. So it was a July into August butterfly, and it's now a June into July butterfly. I suspect that the very high peak that is shown on this is probably slightly false, because we're dealing with a fairly small number of butterflies flying in Hertfordshire at that time, but it's remarkably earlier nonetheless. Meadow brown shows not quite the same pattern. It tends to fly now. It doesn't show up very well on the graph because so many of them fly during June and July, but there's definitely more flying now in the last week of May than there used to be, though it's difficult to tell that from this graph, I admit. It's declining earlier, which isn't surprising, but it's not declining as quickly down to, there are more September records now than there used to be. So it's actually got a very long flight period now from May to September. No evidence really that there is a second brood. It just seems to be perhaps that what's happening in Hertfordshire and Middlesex is what textbooks say happens on, say, some downland sites where there is just an extended emergence, possibly because of the warmth that was always on south-facing chalk slopes, which had enabled a longer flight period and a longer emergence to take place. And that now seems to really be happening in our area, somewhat north of the, for instance, the North and the South Downs. And the gatekeeper, similar pattern, not a great deal to add. It's just a similar pattern of peaking earlier and just generally flying early. It's just, I think the black and the white and the orange help to show over a longer period quite what a difference that we're now seeing. And even the chalk hill blue, which obviously is confined to a very small area, few small areas of Hertfordshire, that is showing the same pattern, with it flying earlier, peaking earlier, and there always used to be fairly reliably records into September, and there still are occasionally, but it's much more likely to have gone by the third week of August now. And this is the holly blue. This is slightly different, and there's a couple of interesting things about the holly blue. One, which this graph doesn't really show, is that there seems to be and we'll come on to another chart to show this, a more consistent third brood in the autumn. But you can see that the two broods in relative size between the spring and the summer are still the same sort of relative size. But in fact, it is actually peaking and flying slightly later than it did in 1975 to 1994 during the spring brood. It'd be interesting to speculate on why that may be. And you can see that there is almost a continuous period of flight now across the whole year, whereas it really did have a gap. And I can certainly remember that there would have been a couple of weeks in June where you wouldn't expect to see holly blues, but now they keep going throughout the summer. And this is an attempt to show the brood that now appears in the autumn. So this is, I'll try and explain this graph. Ratio of holly blue records from September onwards to records received, because obviously you could say, looking out down there, well, of course there's more holly blue records in September onwards because we're getting a lot more records. But what I've actually done is done the proportion of the holly blue records as a proportion of the total number of records received. And you can see from the chart, the table on the left hand side, that has steadily increased with a blip around about the beginning of the century. And the chart, I think, shows that with the trend line, that we're seeing more and more holly blue records within the autumn. And so that is going into an increasingly large partial third brood for this species. So far, it doesn't seem to be having any great effect on their numbers because it's a reliably common butterfly. I'm not sure, and I haven't mapped this at all, but all the textbooks talk about a relationship with parasites which cause, I think if I remember rightly, something like a 7-year cycle of boom and bust. and I'm not sure that we're really seeing that to the same degree now. Okay, common blue, 2 broods, the same sort of pattern, earlier flight in both broods, and earlier peak in the summer, but not necessarily a particularly earlier peak in the spring. So that's the butterflies. Well, I thought I would just close up by discussing a few moths as well, but just to explain what this is all about. Most moth recording is done in people's back gardens, running a light trap. There's much less recording in the countryside for obvious logistical reasons. For various unfortunate reasons, we haven't actually got all the moth data for the last couple of years. So from the whole of Hertfordshire and Middlesex. So what I've done is indulge myself a bit here and just use data from my back garden, which obviously is a fairly small number of butterflies, and it's just one point in space. But I think we can see some similar patterns to the butterflies, and these species that I'm going to feature here are all ones which up until a few years ago were regarded as not found in our area, mainly because they were migrants that would get across to Britain every year, mainly recorded on the peak places in the south coast like Dungeness and the Lizard and various Portland Bird Observatory and so on, right down on the south coast. So basically these moths would be expanding across Europe, get across the continent, from the continent, get across the channel and go to light on these southern coastal recording places and be really rare, you know, the kind of moths that you'd leap up and down if you got them in your moth trap in the morning. So this is the white point, and this has gone from 2016 when they first started appearing, and the numbers on the left hand side are physical numbers recorded in any particular year in my garden, which is in suburban Hertfordshire, so not a particularly special place. And you can see that there's some ups and downs, but it's noticeable that over the last few years this is now a fairly common and expected moth in my moth trap, and I know from talking to other people in other people's moth traps as well. The oak processionary moth, this is obviously one that there's been a lot of publicity about, and its possible effect on both the hairs from the caterpillars and the nests on humans and pets, but also its effect on oak trees. And you can see again, late 2000s upward, it's going up and up. So smaller numbers, but the increase in numbers each year is pretty consistent. The Jersey tiger, now I know Liz will laugh at the numbers on the left hand side there, because my 200 to 250 in a year is what she would get in a poor night. But if we use her data or my data, we'd still have the same pattern, that this moth suddenly exploded from one colony in London, suddenly exploded up the Lee Valley, basically, it would seem, into Hertfordshire, and then has spread out and spread over much more of the country. So you can see that the numbers have gone up, they go up and down a bit. Obviously that can be weather related, but this is another moth which has obviously found conditions. When you think that until a few years ago it was confined to the Channel Islands and South Devon, the warmest places in Britain, and now it quite happily lives over a great chunk of southern and eastern Britain, and expanding its pattern, indeed included in the big butterfly count, because it's such a familiar day flying moth, though it also flies very actively at night. The small ranunculus is one that comes and goes. This was a moth that has established itself in Britain and then gone, then come back, then gone, then come back. But around about the 2012, it re-established itself in Kent, and although the numbers are going up and down, you can see that there are many more now, and then the numbers are quite low, admittedly. But if you look for the number of larvae, if you look at prickly lettuce, which is a common roadside weed, it's sometimes easier to find the larvae than it is to see the adults. And so this is another moth which, having had a tenuous existence in Britain, now seems to be establishing itself back in the country. The L. album wainscot is like the white point. It's very closely related to the white point, and you can see again it has increased in 2016. It's just been on basically an upward trend, and shows no signs of declining. And although some of these may still be migrants, as I suggested, we never used to get that many migrants getting up to this area, and almost certainly with the number of records, they're actually breeding now in this country. Toadflax brocade is another one that's increased. Probably the spread of purple toadflax, which is its larval food plant, along things like railway lines, because it likes dry, gravelly places, has helped, but that's now a common garden moth. Black spotted chestnut is seen in smaller numbers. This is a winter flying moth, and although it did decline a bit in 2025, certainly I've seen quite a few in 2026, and so this is almost certainly taking advantage of warmer winters to expand into this country. The coronet is an internal expansion. It was always present in the west, and it's gradually moved its way through central England, across the Chilterns, and again you can see is now pretty common in East Hertfordshire, and is continuing its eastward spread. So again, there must be something in the climatic conditions which are enabling that to happen. Tree lichen beauty, which you can see is a very variable moth, is showing a similar pattern. It started earlier than some of the others, about 10 years earlier than some of the others, but it continues to increase. It comes and goes, and don't forget this is just data from one trap in one garden, so there's going to be more variation. I mean, for instance, some years I might have gone on holiday for a couple of weeks when it was flying, so that could explain some of the dips. Clancy's rustic is a recent one. It's only, again, this was one of the exciting migrants that people would report, and now it seems to have established itself, come up from the south coast, is now quite happily living, certainly in Hertfordshire and North London. But we need to look the other way. The V moth, whose caterpillar feeds on currants, like blackcurrant, red currant, etc., was never a common moth, but you can see that its peak was 1998, and that since 1999 none have been seen, and I believe the V moth is virtually now absent from the whole of the country. So what has caused that? Some people say it's people using pesticides on currants and blackcurrants, but I don't think that can be the whole story, because there are plenty of organic gardeners and allotment growers, and it's not unusual to see black currants and red currants growing ferally within the countryside, in my experience, and they're certainly not being sprayed. And the garden tiger, well, one of the best known moths probably, and this is a slightly fuzzy picture because this was taken pre-digital. This is a scan of a pre-digital photograph, because as you can see, never did trap many of them. Peaked, if you can call it a peak, in 1997, and again not recorded in my garden, and certainly very rare across the whole of Hertfordshire and Middlesex, though the odd one turns up from time to time. So something is affecting that, and that's been suggested that it's down to do with winter weather and the damage that causes to its caterpillars, which come out to feed on mild days in January and then get hit by sharp frosts in February, which gets rid of most of them, or if not all of them in a lot of cases, hence very few records in the summer. The bird's wing is one that is showing the similar kind of pattern. It's still present, but again, why is that? So that's all I've got to say about this. So although I said, can we predict long-term changes? I think that was a bit of a teaser. I'm not sure we can predict long-term changes, but I think what we can predict is there are going to be a lot of changes. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much, Andrew. That's really fascinating talk. We're going to throw it open to questions now. If you'd like to take the slide down, and if people want to open up their cameras and be ask a question, then please do. If you don't want to put your camera on, then just raise your hand or speak up, and we'll see what we can do. Just while we're waiting for the first question, I want to jump in myself and ask Andrew which will be the next butterfly species to become resident in Hertfordshire. I think we've had six species we've got now that we didn't have 30 years ago, which is brown hair streak, Venus blue, dark green, silverwash, purple emperor, and small blue. So we've already had quite a lot of butterflies added to our local list, but which do you think will be the next one or
Very
two?
good. I don't know. Well, who knows if things are expanded from Hutchinson's Bank in South London? Who knows what might get here? But there's no sign that any of the interesting species that have been introduced there, and after all, it's only Croydon, were to spread. I don't think they will, but then it could be one of those. It'd be but I can't see us getting Glanville fritillary or Marsh fritillary or many of the other exciting things that occur there. So I don't know. What might be the next one to disappear is the corollary of that, of course. And unfortunately, I think we know what the answer to that might be.
Cool. We've got one
Like small
question.
tortoise shell.
We've got one question in the chat from Jed, which says, "Have you got anything on clouded yellows?"
Yeah, I've got stuff on clouded yellows, but I didn't put it in here because there isn't a vast amount of data from the older period. I think one comment I would make is that we haven't had a clouded yellow year since 2000. I think it's 2000. It may have been 2001. I can't remember off the top of my head, which was the last year when they bred in large numbers in the county. Last year there were a reasonable number around, but if farmers keep growing lots of clover and lucerne, it does seem to attract them in when they do come across as migrants. But I think we're still reliant on them coming in from the continent. I mean, there have been a few breeding records on the south coast, but I suspect we're probably still at a stage where the clouded yellow is not going to be able to establish itself long term in Hertfordshire. I don't know if that was the question that was being asked, but
No, I noticed in the report that there was being some pretty spectacular punchy figures saying that the distribution change from 2020 to 24 was up 250% and the abundance change was up 100%. But
yeah,
I think it is pretty much up and down each year. I know I have seen photographs coming around on social media of people finding caterpillars and things on the cliffs at Southbourne near Bournemouth
yeah, yeah.
this winter. It does seem
That's
to have
been the
been
case for
breeding
that's
there
been
for
the case
several
for a number
years,
of
hasn't it?
years.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean,
But
I walked along the under the cliffs at Southbourne. Didn't try climbing any of them a couple of weeks ago, but didn't see any sign of any clouded yellow activity, even on a mild day. But
oh, okay. Oh, we've got a picture of Jeff's camera, but no Jeff. Did you want to ask a question, Jeff?
No, sorry, I had to duck out and I just jumped back in again, and I
Oh.
forgot to mute myself when I came back in.
Okay.
Sorry.
I think one thought that did occur to me, Andrew, going for we were talking about the small tortoise shells and their sad decline locally, which I think has been really marked. I think I think my best visit to small tortoiseshells about 10 years ago. I saw 125 on my allotments in one afternoon, and I think the whole of last year, I think I saw one in St Albans district as a whole, which is a pretty sad state of affairs. But when I used to get them hibernating in my shed, I think the point you made about a lack of resources going through the long hibernation is exactly right. Because I had a situation where, some years they were pretty much all in hibernation by the middle of July, and they weren't coming out again until March the following year. So they were incredibly long time, 9 months or so in hibernation. And I think that it just was using up too much of the fat and sugars that they've got stored in their body. I can remember finding one day would just come out of hibernation, and it literally was doing backflips on the floor of the shed. It just hadn't got the energy even to fly. And I think 2024, when they all there was a really hot sunny day, and they all emerged quite early, and came out, and then there was about 4 weeks where it was just very cold and wet, and they couldn't fly around or feed. And that was the last I seen of them. I've virtually seen none since then. I think they just got finished off because it was not just bad weather, but a combination of going into hibernation early to avoid the hot summers, and then just being really low on resources when they do come out. And it's interesting that the experience we're having here is very different to what's happening in Northern Ireland and Yorkshire, where the small tortoiseshells are doing much better, and often up there where they used to have just a single brood in the year, and they're now having two broods in the year. And I had when I was writing about small tortoiseshells, I had people coming, writing to me from all over the world about them. And like in Japan, someone said they're very much a montane species. They're, on my mountain, they're always above 1,000 meters and always below sort of 1,200 meters. There's quite a small climate niche where they seem to do really well. And if it's hotter than that or colder than that, they don't disappear altogether, but they don't thrive. And I think probably what's happened is because our warming, that their ideal climate niche is just now a little bit further north than it was before. And it's interesting because they had the disappearing was being noticed a lot sooner in London. In Hertfordshire, it's happened in the last couple of years. In London,
that's right.
People were saying so 5 years ago, and of course London is that little bit warmer. So I think they're actually they're a bit fussy, or they don't do well unless they're in just the right conditions, and we're just not quite there anymore, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, isn't it? With a lot of these species, niches that were available to them have moved north, and we've created new niches for other species. But the trouble is, I think with the warming of the climate and the continual change, which is one of the things that I was trying to bring out in the talk, we're going to see continual change in our area, but it's not always clear whether the butterflies can actually keep up with that particular climatic change. I mean, it's intriguing. I'm just going on the records from 2026 this year that have come through on iRecord. I think there's been 2 small tortoiseshell records compared to, well, dozens and dozens of brimstone, comma, and peacock. I mean, I've seen one, and I think one's been seen down in the hotspot near Heathrow Airport. But I mean, I don't know if it's an omen, but the one I saw was in a cemetery.
Is the other numbers of small tortoiseshells linked to the parasitoid Stomia? Because there was a huge dip about 20 years ago. I thought 10 years ago they had recovered. Are we seeing sort of cyclical numbers here?
I don't know. I have a feeling that Stomia, and this is I can't produce any evidence at this point. I think the Stomia thing was certainly a problem, but they seem to recover from that quite well. And the numbers that we're seeing now are much lower than they were even during the Stomia years. And I think the difference, as Malcolm and I have been talking about with the the way that they're now behaving in the summer is quite a change. And I don't think that's related to parasitism. I think that is related to a general warming. I mean, obviously a new parasite doesn't help a species, but the small tortoiseshell did seem to spring back. And I haven't noticed a lot of sturmia. I mean, I haven't noticed a lot of small tortoiseshells either, but I have seen sturmiabella around small tortoiseshells, and nothing like that recently. So that may still be a factor, but I think the general warming is probably a greater factor now, and that would speak to what Malcolm was saying about they're still, in the cooler, more northern areas of Britain, that they are still thriving.
Yeah, and I'd add to that and say I think that the arrival of Sturmiabella was probably in itself linked to warming, because it wasn't something that was here historically. But that when you get a new insect coming in, often it does very well in the first few years. So I think Sturmiabella probably thrived, and now it's sort of like a lot of things, it's sort of settled down a bit because it's been around for a while, and it's probably got its own predators and things which attack it. So much as we've seen plagues of things like box tree moth in areas, the areas in London where box tree moth's been longest, they're now, the population is still there, but it's not in plague proportions like it used to be, because the birds have got their eye in, and they start picking off the caterpillars and eating them. So often the first wave of an insect seems like an invasion, and you often get scare stories about alien insects arriving, and they do come in big numbers, but once they've been here for a little while, they start getting picked off by all the other wildlife that is probably a bit suspicious of them to start with, but once they've got their eye in, we'll start picking them off. So I think the other thing is Sturmiabella is clearly one of several parasitoids that do attack the small tortoiseshell. The people that have actually studied it have come up with records of quite a few. It's not by no means the only thing, but it definitely was a factor for a while. But I don't think it is the overwhelming cause of decline. I mean, if we'd have been talking 15 years ago, I'd have said, yeah, it has caused decline. But of course, one of the things with small tortoiseshells is they can migrate, and a couple of times in the last 20 years there've been small, decent sized small tortoiseshell migrations, probably ones that have been coming en masse from somewhere that's all got a bit too hot beyond their ideal climate niche, and then they've decided to take off and try and head somewhere cooler. I can remember being on the East Coast one year and seeing absolutely thousands of them all parked along the dike where they surrounded by water. No flowers or anything. It was just the first bit of land they came to after flying over the North Sea. But they were clearly come en masse looking for somewhere that was a bit slightly more hospitable climate for them to thrive in.
Yeah,
So
I was going to say 2012 was the year when we had the last reasonable sized migration of small tortoiseshells, as you say, across the East Coast, and there doesn't seem to have been anything like that migratory movement of small tortoiseshells in the succeeding 13 years.
Well, there hasn't been anything coming into our area. They might have been heading out, going up to Yorkshire.
Well, yeah, but that's what I'm saying. There's been no. So I mean, you could argue that maybe there is some genetic variation which might help in the ones that came from Europe, but there
Yes,
hasn't been
I think yeah, I've read that they may have, the ones that come in may have more resistance to the parasites because they've been living with them longer. I think it's speculation. I don't know whether anyone's actually studied that.
I don't think it's a species that likes heat, because in the southeast of France, it's completely absent. But curiously enough, like your Japanese correspondent, when you go up into the mountains, 2,000 meters and above, the only thing flying is a small tortoiseshell, often near to 0 degrees. So it's not bothered by cold, but it doesn't seem to like excessive heat.
Yeah, interesting. Dee's put a comment in the chat to say that she saw hundreds in the west of Ireland in July last year. I'm assuming that's small tortoiseshells rather than the parasites, but that sounds very much like that would have been a migration.
Yeah, no, there were small tortoiseshells everywhere.
Yeah.
In the pub. I had to try and rescue them from the
In
pub.
the pub?
Yes.
Oh, that must have been fun.
Yeah, yeah. I was trying to get them out of the pub. Some of them had flown in. We were having lunch. Yeah.
Yes, I had to rescue a peacock that had come out of hibernation and gone to sleep in the middle of the pavement last week.
Mm.
Cool. Okay. Would anyone else have any questions for Andrew before we let him go for a well-earned rest? Any Arsenal fans will be pleased to hear they're winning 1-0 at half time. Anything more in the chat? No?
Every soccer game is 1-0. Every single soccer game is 1-0. No surprise.
Well, I think statistics will prove otherwise.
No. By the
Andrew,
way,
have you got a graph of how many goals are scored in the average soccer matches?
one goal scored in the average game. By the way, we have 3 species of tortoiseshells in Massachusetts, USA checklist. Both the recent tortoiseshells have retreated northward, and we have one record of small tortoiseshell from about 100 years ago. Yeah.
Oh.
The Milbert's tortoiseshell, my favorite butterfly, and the Compton tortoiseshell, they've gone to the north, like yours.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I did hear a report of a large tortoiseshell being seen in Kent today. So maybe we'll get them coming in instead of small tortoiseshells.
There's quite
In fact,
a few
in a few years'
reports,
time,
Mike,
large
of
tortoiseshells
ones.
will be our most common ones, and we won't see any small ones.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That was
Okay.
very interesting. Thank you.
Thanks,
Yes,
Steve.
lots of nice positive comments in the chat. Thank you very much. If you wished you'd been taking notes or want to see any of the graphs and things again, I will be putting the recording up on the Herts Middlesex Butterfly Conservation YouTube channel. It should be there in the morning if all things go well. So if you want to study the facts and figures at your leisure, then please do. And if you spot any anomalies or think of any difficult questions, then I'm sure Andrew will be only too pleased to answer on another occasion.
In writing, yes.
Yes, sorry, that's a hospital pass, isn't it? Great. Okay, well, look, next talk's on the 1st of April, online, or allotments face-to-face in Berkhamsted on the 24th of March. We hope everyone gets to go and see lots of butterflies. I've seen brimstone, peacock, and comma so far, which I think probably the 3 most spotted. So, yeah, they do seem to have been having a good time this week and last, and I think tomorrow is another sunny day. So good luck to everyone that's out looking. I'm mostly concentrating on nettle beds at present. That seems to be the best place to go when they're in the sun. But I'm sure you'll be looking close to home. Lots of more comments coming in, but I think they're all saying thank you, very interesting. Nice to hear something about
Thanks,
moths. Great. All right. Well, thanks ever so much. I'll close it down now and process the recording.
Thanks.
Cheers all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Leslie.